Thank you, Sue Ellen, and thank you all for being here tonight, and welcome Peter back to Martha's Vineyard. It is such a pleasure and an honor to share the stage with you and talk about this treasure of a book. I feel like I'm echoing. Looking to Get Lost. Am I echoing? Oh, I only hear that. Okay, fine. I'm sorry. Which profiles artists you've known and written about over the past 4 decades and more. And the book is a rich illustration of your approach and writing about music. Rather than focus on technique, your interest is in the artist, the life behind the music, their history, and their aspirations, which inform the music they make. Sue Ellen mentioned the NEH Institute that I've was involved in for 20 years, and Peter was one of our faculty members who came every summer, which was really a treat. And he and Julian Bond just loved to play records. They play records and talk about them. But I remember one session in particular that really illustrates how Peter approaches this subject and its impact. And it was a session that he did focusing on Sam Cooke and his song, A Change Is Gonna Come, which came out in 1964 at the peak of the Civil Rights Movement. And he played the music, talked about Cooke, the times, and just it was really a beautiful and marvelous session. And when it ended, one of the college teachers in our class who taught at Bennett College in North Carolina, who's about my age, said, "I've listened to that song for my whole life, and this is the first time I heard it." And I think that is a statement of the power of this work. And his commitment to really getting at the heart of the matter. And as Sue Ellen mentioned, I mean, you all have the book, and in reading the book, I had my Ultimate Ears right next to me and Spotify, and just kept, going back and forth between the profile, listening to the music, checking out your recommendations. Truly a total immersive experience, and one that I look forward to sharing with my students when I get back in the classroom. Let's begin our discussion with how did you, a kid who grew up in Boston during the late 40s and the 1950s, get to this place to do what you do?
I tried to explain in the book, who knows? It's just, it's hard to say. But I mean, I think that I grew up in a family with a great commitment to social justice, to a sense of the dispossessed, whether they were black, white, immigrants, or whatever. And maybe that made me susceptible to a degree to it, but in a very simple way. And am I echoing too much, or is it okay? But in a very simple way, when I was about 15. 2 things happened when I was 15. One was I read Ernest Hemingway's interview in the Paris Review, the writers' interviews they have there. And he talked about how his commitment to writing every day, no matter what he did the night before, no matter what he planned to do the following night, the important thing was to write every day. And he didn't set out to write a specific number of words. But if he got 500 words, that was really great. Well, I decided when I was 15, okay, I may never be Ernest Hemingway. I wanted to be a writer. That was from the time I was a little kid. And, I may not be as good as Hemingway, but I'll bet I could write 500 words a day. And I committed myself then, at 15, to writing every day, no matter what else happened. And I didn't write today, but that basically is held true from that age on. But also when I was 15, the brother of a friend of mine went to the Newport Folk Festival, and he came back. He was a very cool guy, and he came back with a bunch of albums, folk albums mostly, but some blues albums mixed in with them. And this friend of mine, Bob Smith, and I don't know what it was, but it just grabbed us both, the blues albums. And we started from that point. I mean, there were very few blues albums available at that time. There might be 2 or 3 Lightning Hopkins, a bunch of Brownie McGhee and Sonny Terry, Leadbelly, Big Bill Broonzy. But we were just totally flipped by it. And that was, to this day, it remains something which is a compelling interest. Nobody I've ever written about, nothing I've ever written about is something I've left behind. I wrote about it initially because I was passionate about it, and I continue to be just as interested in Muddy Waters or Howlin' Wolf or Johnny Shines or Bill Monroe or Merle Haggard today as I was when I first wrote about them. But but the blues was what turned me on to everything, and I just never looked back, and I can't explain it. I mean, it's a music that has gone around the world and reached an audience of people who initially have no knowledge whatsoever of the language in which the words are sung, and yet it's reached them just as much. And one of the things in this book, I interviewed Eric Clapton, and it was not about his career or anything, it was just about the blues. And there was a very disconcerting beginning to the interview when I asked him what first drew him to Robert Johnson, and he said, well, as you so eloquently wrote in your book, and I'm thinking, no, this is not where we can go, we're not supposed to go there. But the point was, basically, there we're about the same age, turned on by exactly the same music, not through some underground connection, but because the music reached us and touched us in the same way. And so that's about the best I can do.
Okay. But there's one extra piece, which you came and talked with my students at Harvard, and I mean, this is really about young people deciding what they'll do, what they're passionate about. So you wrote for Boston After Dark, and you would write essays and go to concerts, and then you wrote you published the book, Feel Like Going Home, Portraits in Blues and Rock and Roll. And when you finished it, you said, okay, that's it, because, you did, and then...
Well, I was such an idealist, I was too pure to do this kind of thing.
So what happened next? I mean, how you ended up coming back to it, I think is just a great story.
Well, the thing was, I wanted to be a writer. There was no such thing as wanting to be a rock writer because there was no such thing. But when these underground publications started, a kid I know started up a magazine called Crawdaddy, which preceded Rolling Stone, and I knew him a little bit, and he said, how would you like to write for the magazine? And they wrote about Jefferson Airplane and Moby Grape and the Grateful Dead, and so I said, I don't think you want me. I said, but if you want me to write about Robert Pete Williams and Buddy Guy, who was pretty much unknown at the time, I said, if that interests you, Skip James, I said, I'll do that. So he said, no, sure, anything you want to do. So my whole commitment, and it's like the writing, it remains my commitment to this day insofar as writing about the music goes, is just to tell people about this music that I think is so great. And that was when Boston After Dark, which became the Boston Phoenix, started. I knew a guy who was the drama critic, and it was a funny publication because it started as an adjunct to the Harvard Business School newsletter, and it was a great idea because the entertainment was not covered in the Globe or the Herald, and so they got ads. They got all these ads for clubs and for concerts and stuff, but they didn't have any content, so they had to invent content. So, they came. My friend introduced me to the editor and said, would you like to write? And I said, yeah, I'd like to write about James Brown. I'd like to write about Chuck Berry. I'd like to write about Bo Diddley. I'd like to write about Jerry Lee Lewis. And he said, I think it may have been she at that point. They said, fine, whoever it was. And so I just wrote, that's what I wrote about. I wrote about Elvis in one of the first things, but I wrote about the things that people I cared about the most. Well, being somebody who wanted to be a writer, I felt like I wrote Feel Like Going Home. It was my statement. I had gone around all these years. It was a book of profiles. It was a big departure for me because up until then I'd been writing these little squibs almost, describing, telling people about James Brown's show. And if they wanted to see theater that was greater than anything, John Arden was doing all these, what were the happenings at that time? I mean, people were into happenings. I said, if you want to see the greatest happening of all, go to the James Brown show. But I would describe the show in detail, or describe Howlin' Wolf in detail, which is just an extraordinary experience. Then with Feel Like Going Home, I switched over and I wrote these profiles, which was actually my great deliverance because it was like writing fiction, but it was real life fiction. But I thought, okay, I've done it. I've done the best I can. I've sold people on this. Now I'll go back to writing my novel. And I won't sully myself with all this commercial work. And then this friend of mine, Jim Miller, who's now a philosopher, political scientist of considerable renown, but that time he was a music editor of the Real paper, and then he went on to edit the first Rolling Stone Illustrated History of Rock and Roll. And he was like the devil tempting me. And he suggested that I do a story on Waylon Jennings, whom I didn't really know that much about because I've been so blues confined. And I started listening, and I said, oh my God, Waylon Jennings, this is just like the blues. I mean, it's a different genre, but it's, and so I spent about a week going to see Waylon Jennings at a club in Cambridge, and I interviewed him at the Holiday Inn on Mass Ave, and I published this. And then Jim said, well, how about Bobby Blue Bland, whom I'd always loved? And so then I said, I thought, well, by then I really had I'd finished my novel, my latest novel. None of these novels ever went anywhere, but I still have hopes that they may. So I signed, I said, yeah, that'd be great, Bobby Blue Bland. And I spent about a week with him when he was playing at the Jazz Workshop or Paul's Mall, I don't remember which, and hung around with him, and he was staying at a hotel in Copley Square with his wife and baby daughter. And one night, he was playing at the Sugar Shack, which was kind of a den of iniquity in downtown Boston. And one night, the band leader, Mel Jackson, called for a horn rehearsal after the show, which was like about 2 o'clock in the morning. And so I hung around, and all the women who had plied their trade were done for the night, and the drug dealers had gone home, and the tinsel was up still, but it was looking pretty dreary in the club. And there was no rehearsal. The horn players either never showed up or there was some rebellion against. But I realized at that moment, I had just done an interview for a job at a high-class private school outside of Boston. I knew the headmaster, and I talked to the head of the English department because I had been teaching at BU and the job had run out. And, I thought, well, I ought to be doing something. And I had this interview and talked about Tristram Shandy and Last Exit to Brooklyn and all these favorite books of mine. And either that night or the next night was the horn rehearsal. It never was. And I realized after that horn rehearsal that didn't happen. I said, I'd rather spend the rest of my life sitting in a club, with all the lights up and the tinsel, all this. I'd rather spend my life just hanging around for a horn rehearsal that never happens than teaching in an exclusive private school. So that was how my life's course was set.
Off the deep end, man. Off the deep end.
And it was all due to Bobby Blue Bland, who you should, he should be among the first that you go and listen to again if you've listened to him before or listen to him now.
So can you talk a bit about your approach to the writing? Because I remember early on when you would go and initially listening to the blues, you said, I want to experience this music. I don't want to analyze it.
Right.
And so but then you did. So what has been your approach that really distinguishes you as a music writer to writing about the music?
I'm not going to say it distinguishes me.
Okay.
That would be...
Okay,
but
maybe that's not the word, but the path that you carved out for yourself.
But no, I saw it, and I still see it as descriptive in sort of the Chekhovian sense. I don't mean to elevate myself to that, but I want to describe things and provide the telling detail. I want to, for me, any writing, and I still write fiction too, but any writing involves total immersion. And if you don't give it everything you have, well, if I don't, then don't bother. It's not worth it. And if you're not totally committed to it, forget about it. So regardless of what it is, you could be an electrician, you could be a physician, you could be it doesn't matter. But this is the credo by which my father lived. He was almost 101 when he died, and he was still going to work 4 days a week at the Mass General because his work his work was what he loved. He was committed to public health. I don't know what he would think about. I don't know what he would think about now, but I do know what he would think. It really all had to do, and still has to do, with just total commitment, total immersion, and trying to find not the first thing that strikes your mind, not the first thing that you observe, not the easy story. I mean, in many cases, the story which is the most common one or the most attention-grabbing one that'll get you the most clicks or something is not the one you want to include, because it'll really lead people away from the real truth of the story. So it's immersing yourself to the extent that you're telling the story as much as possible from the inside out. I don't mean by telling it in the first person, but you know, I want to tell, if I'm writing about Elvis, say, I'm not interested in what the world thinks of Elvis. I'm not interested in the reviews that a particular album got, even if I wrote the review. You know, what I'm interested in is what was Elvis's experience cutting these sides? What were the triumphs? What were the things that he was disappointed in? What were the aspirations? And I guess most of all, and in an idealistic sense, this is returning to idealism, you know, I think that it's far more important, it's of far greater significance what a person's aspirations are than what their achievement is. And the achievement is great, but I mean, some of the people I've written about have never been recognized. Some of them may never have actually achieved what they might have been capable of given better breaks or given a more single-minded purpose. But their aspirations are what, to me, I mean, and that's the thing I've asked everybody, and I wasn't aware of this. I mean, this is all great in retrospect. But, you know, every single person I've interviewed, whether it was Muddy Waters or it was Skip James, you know, or it was Johnny Shines, or it was Jerry Lee Lewis or Charlie Rich, I mean, these were all in the first book. Every person that I've interviewed from the beginning to end, I've been talking to them about their creative process. And I don't say to them, and I wasn't even saying to myself, hey, let's talk about creativity, you know. Let's talk. But I mean, it would be if I was talking to Merle Haggard. I was telling Pat this story. The second time that I interviewed Merle, I spent a fair amount of time with Merle Haggard, and I became friendly with a good number of people that, you know, that I wrote about over the years. I'm very friendly. I can't claim that about Merle, although I would have been glad to have been friendly with him. But Merle was a pretty moody guy. But I thought, okay, I'm going to talk to him. He was such a great songwriter. I mean, there is no greater artist in the 20th century, you know, popular artist than Merle Haggard, and both as a writer, as a singer, and as his own producer. But I said, okay, I'm going to ask him about his songwriting, because he wrote on such a diverse subject matter. He took on so many different roles. He imagined so many situations. And so I asked him, you know, it's the kind of questions that Pat is asking me, these open-ended questions. And I mean, what else can you ask people? You know, you're not trying to dictate what they say. So I said, well, so, you know, were there any other songwriters? I mean, I knew what I thought. Any other songwriters that interviewed you? And he just looked at me, and his chihuahuas were yapping, and there was all kinds of stuff going on in this little motel room. And I said, so, you know, were there any songwriters who interviewed? And it went like, boom, 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 boom. And we went on for about 8 or 10 seconds. Nope. And so I thought, oh, gee, I guess that wasn't a good question. But the thing was, and this has nothing to do with writing in a sense, it just has to do with, you know, relating to people. I thought, you know, I didn't just jump in and say, okay, I'm going home, you've insulted me, or, you know, I know when you don't, I know when I'm not wanted. I mean, I waited, and within a short period of time, he was expounding and expanding upon not just his influences, the people who influenced him, like Lefty Frizzell in particular, but a bunch of songwriters, but also his method and methodology in writing, and what he sought to do, and how he hated some of his most popular songs, where he just didn't enjoy performing them because they were so simplistic, and other songs, which, like Shelley's Winter Love, for example, which was so far removed from what he was known for, and he couldn't sing them in concert, but those were the songs he was proudest of. And then he talked about a song called Footlights, which is one thing I was thinking about, which is about the life of a person on stage, where the audience is imagining one thing, and yet that person is could be somebody completely different, and is going through something at that moment that can't ever be revealed. And it's really a great, great song. And so he talked at length about that. So, so anyway, so the note was worth it. But you can't think, this again doesn't have to do with writing, but you can't think, well, this person should really be grateful that I've entered their lives. This person is, should just think, oh, wow, isn't it wonderful that this person wants to find out? You can't think like that. You can't think anything, and you can't take it personally other than what you want to do is to allow the person to bring out of themselves what they want to say and what they have to say and so sometimes it takes a lot of waiting around, and I don't want to say it takes a lot of humility. It isn't really that, but you want to just present yourself in a way that shows your respect for the person you're talking to, just like you would want to in any everyday contact, but also has the ability to sort of bridge the gap between you. Because I've never written about anybody remotely like me from a background remotely like me. And when I started out, I was writing about nothing but, black blues singers. People sometimes ask me today, or over the years, they say, well, how did it feel to interview somebody? I mean, you were from such a different background. But this is, my background is as different from Merle Haggard or from Waylon Jennings or from Bill Monroe. I have nothing in common with them in terms of background, but what I hope what I have in common with them is just, an ambition to say something meaningful and to create something, that comes from inside.
That's well put. It's such a rich book with so many profiles, and so I just want to maybe draw our attention to a few of them and give people a glimpse of the rich texture of the book and how you have approached different profiles. And one that was Ray Charles. I mean, you knew Ray Charles for a long stretch of years and had spent time with him, and you kind of carved out a moment to put in the book that's so pivotal, and it's really a fresh look at that moment in '54 when he.
When he created I Got a Woman.
I Got a Woman. Yeah. Could you talk a bit about that and how you kind of put that together?
Well, this was something I had been wanting to do for a long time, and it was to write about, as Pat says, this pivotal moment, not just for Ray Charles, where he discovered his own musical and creative identity and never looked back from that point on. Up till then, he had been a Nat King Cole imitator or emulator. I mean, he was always original, but he hadn't found his own voice, and he hadn't succeeded to the extent that he could put together a band or carry a band with him that would express. I mean, this is like Duke Ellington, who kept his band on the road all those years, not to make money, but to have somebody, or an entity, an orchestra that could express what was in his mind, what was in his and Billy Strayhorn's compositions that had the tonal, and that's what Ray Charles was looking to do. But and so I thought of this thing as this I Got a Woman, which for the first time explicitly brought or translated a gospel song called It Must Be Jesus in this case, into a secular setting, gave it secular lyrics and a secular background, and which essentially just set the stage for everything that happened in rhythm and blues, soul from that point on, but also in rock and roll to a huge extent. I mean, just had an enormous and incalculable influence on people like Elvis, as well as Little Walter, for example. I mean, Little Richard, Little Walter, so many of the rock and roll and blues mainstays. But so I thought and what I wanted to do was to animate this moment. I knew the four of the people who were instrumental in it. I knew Ray over a period of time. I mean, I don't want to claim, great closeness. I'd like to, but I can't. But I spent a fair amount of time with him, and I had written a full-length profile of Ray, which I had published as a magazine piece, and he was a big part of my book, Sweet Soul Music, with sort of a separate, sort of a profile historical thing. But what I set out to do in the chapter in the book was to animate this moment when the inspiration for the song came about as Ray is driving along in his, I think it was a DeSoto. I mean, Ray was blind, so he's being driven, although he did drive sometimes. Ray was just an astonishing person. I mean, but anyway, he, you know, when he heard it, he was with his orchestra leader from New Orleans, whose name I'm going to forget now. Maybe somebody out there remembers it. But no, Dave Bartholomew was with Fats Domino, and a great band leader and orchestrator. But this was a trumpet player, and I've almost got his name, but I can't quite think of it. But anyway, and they worked it out. But I wanted to animate this moment, so I knew Ray, I knew Jerry Wexler quite well, who was the co-head of Atlantic Records. I knew Ahmet Ertegun to some extent, who was the founder of Atlantic Records. Ray summoned them to come down from New York to Atlanta to record the song. And I knew Zenas Sears, who was the DJ in Atlanta, who owned a station called WAOK. He was white, but it was an all-black station. And he was nothing but rhythm and blues. And I had talked to them all, not with the aim of writing this, but I had talked to them all about this moment. And so what I did was to write something which I set out to animate this moment. I mean, I had all these people, I knew what they thought, I had talked to them to some extent, and I had I put a fair amount of research. So rather than just tell it as a dull and dusty story, I wanted to tell it as if it were like you were telling a short story, but with strictly limited to the facts, but also limited to the passion that went into creating it and the vision that went into it. So that was really what I was trying to do. And it was exciting for me to do it because it was doing something completely different with material that I had used in other ways and that I was in possession of, but I had never thought to use in so specific and focused a way.
And that was in 1954, so the year of the Brown decision. I mean,
yeah.
when you think of what's sort of the ferment during this period, and what you note in the piece, the reactions of various people to this moment, to this song. Albert Murray for one, and Martin Luther King for another.
Yeah, no, Martin Luther King was very, very disapproving. He wrote a monthly column, and I don't remember the name of the magazine. It wasn't Jet or Ebony. It wasn't Sepia, but I don't remember what it was. But he took a very dim view of this mixing of the sacred and profane, which I would like to think that he just felt that, you know, compelled at that moment to offer the moral perspective on it. I don't think, well, whatever, that's what he wrote. But then there's this wonderful correspondence, which you should all read. It's published between Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray in the 50s and into the 60s. And it's so fantastic because Ralph Ellison is such a great writer, but you don't often see him in a particularly unbuttoned mood. And the two of them are just flinging back and forth, motherfucker, and this and that, you know, and just, I mean, that maybe just all kinds of, you know, colloquialisms, let's say. And they're not really thinking about history, looking over their shoulder, and they're so appreciative of Ray Charles. And I forget one of them, I think it's Albert Murray, one of them anyway goes to see Ray Charles in LA and is disappointed at seeing him in a white concert, then sees him at the black club, the big black club in LA. That's terrible, I can't remember its name. But and it just was so phenomenal. But this again, it's a way of, you want to cast your net wide. You don't want to be, it doesn't matter what, and I won't just say white, but it doesn't matter what critics say after the fact. What matters is what people observe at the time, and depending on the accuracy and the emotions that are conveyed at the time. Not what we think we should think, but what actually is thought. And so again, it's when I wrote the Elvis biography, which was a 2-volume thing, I tried to never leave the moment. Always remain, and I tried to do that with the Sam Cooke too. I mean, which was such an exciting book to, you know, to write, and which was really as much about the community as it was about Sam Cooke. But the point is, I never wanted to leave the moment. I never wanted to step back and be looking down from up here or from over here or whatever. And I wanted to remain I didn't want to stick necessarily with the idea that what a person thought at that moment was necessarily the last word, but I wanted to, I never wanted to leave it, because I felt like otherwise you falsify your picture. And I think within that framework, you can convey all kinds of things. You can convey, it doesn't have to be an uncritical view, but it has to be an empathetic view. It may suggest some of the errors that people make, the errors of judgment or of action that we all make, from time to time. Maybe you guys don't, but I do. But you don't want to leave that out. You're not trying to romanticize or put a gloss on it, but you want to do that. And I remember a friend of mine who is a rock critic, and he was so upset, for instance, with the Elvis. How could you not put your review in Rolling Stone from Elvis in Memphis, this album that was so revolutionary and stuff? It had nothing to do with it. I was just looking at it from afar and creating a theory. What was important was how was the album created, and what did the musicians feel, and what did they put into it, and what were they aiming at?
Yeah. I met so many individuals in the book who really I hadn't heard of before, like Doc Pomus. I'd never really heard of him, but I'd been listening to his music since the 1960s. I mean, the songs he wrote. He was a blues man and a songwriter. Mm-hmm. The song we heard, if you could hear it on the tape, Elvis sing "I Need Somebody to Love," and the Drifters, "Save the Last Dance for Me," those songs. But he's a fascinating character. Born in Brooklyn, has polio when he's 6.
Yeah.
And he hears a song by Big Joe Turner that sort of changes his life. Can you say a bit about him? Because that's someone you really got to know well.
Well, so many of these people that I met, it was like meeting somebody that I've been looking for all my life. That was true of Solomon Burke. It was true of Sam Phillips in a certain sense. It was true of Doc Pomus, of J.W. Alexander, Sam Cooke's business partner and sort of mentor. I mean, these were people that, after the initial meet, it was like when we met, I felt like I was meeting somebody that I had known all my life. Not with Sam Phillips, it took a lot longer. With Sam Phillips, about 10 or 15 years after we first met, he said to me, Sam Phillips is the person who had Sun Records, discovered Elvis, discovered Howlin' Wolf, discovered Ike Turner, discovered Johnny Cash, and recorded them. And after I'd known him, I'd say at least 15 years, he says, my son Knox. Now let me tell you something, Peter. He said, now my son Knox, he fell in love with you the minute he met you. But I didn't. And it's true. I think after that things got better, but it took a while. But all of these people, and the thing with Doc Pomus was he wrote me a fan letter when I was at camp. I ran a summer camp for 22 years. And he wrote me a letter at camp, and he just read, I think Feel Like Going Home. It was either Feel Like Going Home or Lost Highway. And it was like a fan letter, and he said, we've got to meet. And he called up right after that, and we did meet. And he's just such an amazing person. And he was born in 25. He was sent away during a polio epidemic, sent away from the city when he was 6 or 7. This is like a Philip Roth novel. It is like the Philip Roth novel. And he gets sent away to the country in Connecticut, and he gets polio, and he's paralyzed for the rest of his life. I mean, his legs are paralyzed, his waist down. And he was somebody who had such warmth, imagination, brilliance, wit, humor, and genuine and concern for the world. And he discovered the blues kind of the way that I did, and the way actually Delbert McClinton describes the same moment in Texas. As he's growing up, Delbert McClinton describes cutting across a neighbor's lawn and hearing Big Joe Turner singing Shake, Rattle, and Roll, and it changed his life. That was it. And for Doc, it was the same. It was pre-Shake, Rattle, and Roll, but it just blew him away. He was on crutches at that point. Eventually, he was in a wheelchair, but he was doing everything he could to stay on crutches. But so he introduced himself to this bar owner or this club as a blues singer, or he was hanging around this club to listen to the blues, and the guy says, "Hey, you're not spending any money, get out." And he says, "No, I'm a blues singer." And and the guy says, "Yeah, you're a blues singer, well, get up on stage, let me hear what you got." And he sang the only song he knew, which was a Big Joe Turner song. He didn't know what key it was in or anything, and he became a white blues singer on crutches in the early 40s, and that was what he did from that point on. But he gave up the singing probably after 10 years when he realized that a white blues singer on crutches was probably not going to set the world. He had an audience, but he had started writing songs, and the moment in his life that really set the tone for his life was when Big Joe Turner, he met him at the Atlantic offices, and Big Joe Turner recorded one song of his, and then I think "You Know I Love You," but I could be wrong. But anyway, Big Joe, his idol, recorded it, and he had continued to have great success. But the most remarkable thing about Doc, one of the many remarkable things, is that he wrote all these hits. He wrote "Save the Last Dance for Me." He wrote hits for Elvis Presley. He wrote hits for rhythm and blues hits. He wrote rock and roll hits. And after being in the business by 1970, he decided, that's it. There's no more rock and roll. It's a short shelf life, and he became a professional gambler, which he did until he was running his own poker game, until this guy who said, "Listen, don't worry, nobody's going to touch you. You're under my protection." And the next day, the guy was found in the Hudson, and Doc said, "Well, this is the kind of protection I don't need." And so in the 80s, he went back to songwriting. Many of these, up-and-coming rock and roll singers, knew his songs, and when they saw this guy showing up at the shows, they idolized him. He started writing songs with Mac Rebennack, with Dr. John. Those were his best-known songs. But he wrote, for a minute, he wrote with Bob Dylan. He wrote with, who sought him out, and a bunch of other people, well-known people. But the biggest thing of all was his songs. He had written all these great songs in the 50s and 60s. The songs that he wrote at the end of his life, he died in 1991, and the songs that he wrote at the end of his life were so much deeper and more profound. He had simplified it. It's kind of somewhat like Sam Cooke, or even like somebody like Nick Lowe, whose music used to be very clever, always was clever, and maybe it's still clever. But the depth of feeling that is in the music, in the songs that he writes now, is so much greater than what he was doing at the beginning. But Doc's songs are just so profound, and there's an album by Johnny Adams of Doc Palmer's songs, which is just so incredible, because it gives voice to what he was doing. And he was, the last time I saw him, he was in the hospital. It wasn't Sloan Kettering, it was a cancer hospital in New York. And he was writing away right up till the moment he died, and some of those songs went on the Johnny Adams album. And he just was one of the most soulful cats I've ever met. And he was, I don't think anyone who ever met him wasn't affected by him in some way.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite pieces in the book, and we heard a song from it, is this collaboration between Elvis Costello and Alan Toussaint in the wake of Katrina, where they did an album as a fundraiser, and Who's Going to Help the Brother Get Further is something we heard on the playlist. And you were there. They had a preview of it at Joe's Pub in New York.
Right.
But he had two remarkable artists, and you kind of capture them and profile them in the context of this moment of Toussaint leaving New Orleans, lost everything.
Yeah,
And,
again, Alan Toussaint is somebody who I know I'm sure most of you know Alan Toussaint's work, and if you don't know it by his name, you know it by all the songs that he recorded that came out of New Orleans, all these great hits that he was both the voice behind me. He was the writer of the song, he was the producer of the session, he played on the sessions. He's a ubiquitous presence, and again, you don't want to misuse the word profound, but he was a truly profound individual, and totally inscrutable. I don't think anybody could say that they knew who the real Alan Toussaint was. I don't know, and I'm sure he was somebody. It doesn't matter. He was an amazing person. But when they got together, they did get together in the wake of Katrina, and both of them were doing these tributes, fundraisers for Katrina, and ran into each other. I don't know if they'd known, they had met before. I know that Alan had done stuff for the band, he had done something for Elvis Costello, but anyway, the idea of doing this collaboration came together. And, for me, the thing that struck me so was the idea of these, I'll tell you, watching, the Beatles, the 7-hour Beatles thing, I was never a Beatles fan, and I guess I am now from watching that, but it was just so amazing to watch this collaboration. Actually, most of all, to watch Paul McCartney. I just never thought about it much, and it just was so amazing. But I thought at the time of Alan Toussaint and Elvis, these were two extraordinary creators, two people of each who had their own voice, a voice. Elvis had always shown great respect for the New Orleans tradition, but I can't say that he had really done anything that extensive that sounded like it. And what I thought was really interesting was just the idea of these two, it wasn't a collision, but the coming together of these two very different sensibilities, creative sensibilities and voices. And so that's what I tried to concentrate on. I don't think I can really summon it up that much here, but I interviewed them separately because I felt like it would be it just wouldn't be fair to have, they would step on each other, or actually what would have happened was Elvis, who was the most voluble person I've ever met, and I mean that in a good sense. Alan wouldn't have stood a chance in that, and Alan was a very deep guy. It wasn't so I interviewed them separately, and to me it just was one of the most interesting things. But I remember trying to sell it. I was going to do it no matter what, and every story I've ever written has been self-generated, but I thought this would be a perfect piece for the Times magazine. And I think from their point of view, nothing could have been a less perfect piece for them. I couldn't get anybody. I wound up publishing it in Paste, which was fine with me. Paste, I think, may still be online, but it just, and yet to me it was just one of the most fascinating things, because it's bringing together these two giants, really, these two people of such expansive imaginative capacities. And the song that Pat was talking about, brother,
who's gonna help the brother get further?
Yeah. Who's gonna, was such an amazing statement by Alan Toussaint in the 70s about the position of the black man and woman in a world which simply was turning its back away from them, which is certainly a song that could be written today and at any point. But so Alan, I can't remember now. Alan took the lead at the start,
yes.
But it just again, it could have become an Alan Toussaint album, but it didn't. It was an album which represented a genuine collaboration, and you had Alan's horns, but Elvis's rhythm section. I wouldn't have chosen having Elvis's rhythm section, but I think still it was better to have it that way, so that you had the individual identities melding. So that was kind of, but it was fascinating, and it was fascinating the degree, the amount of thought that each of them put into it, and into it describing what the accommodations they had made and the choices they had made in putting the music together.
And they went back and recorded in New Orleans, right?
They did, right? Just after it opened up, yeah.
Yeah. It's we're moving close to questions, so I've got more. But the period, the artists you have written about and who are included in this book, it seems that their period as artists, 1930s up through towards the late 20th century. And you have a great comment where you say this was a time when all effective barriers to integration of culture and imagination came down. In that realm, right? And that the smallest town you could be living in, like Lee Smith or Joe Tex, that they became part of this sort of broadening of imagination beyond particularly the barriers of race.
Yeah, although I wouldn't want to suggest that the barriers came down.
No, not the barrier, not
they've
the
gone
physical.
up again.
No, they've gone up again, but
Yeah.
and they were pretty sturdy back through that period. But in this realm, and the role. So I guess what I wanted you to comment on is, the role of the media of that period, radio, in sort of facilitating that, and communications, right, and facilitating that at a time of very rigid separation throughout the country, and then how our current media, sort of post late 20th century to now, I mean, changes that dynamic, shrinks the possibilities, makes them more, just any thoughts? Because again, thinking about the radio and the world that these artists moved in as they listened to each other and sort of responded, incorporated, any thoughts on that?
Well, how much time do we have?
Yeah.
No, I think that radio opened things up so much. I mean, I don't think anybody can imagine a world prior to mass communication at this point. And really that started with the invention of the phonograph and the radio and the prevalence of them from the early 20th century on. I mean, by 1920, almost all of the effective barriers to the mixing of genres had come down. And so there was virtually no one, let's say you take somebody like the Carter family, who had their recording debut in Bristol, Virginia, I think in 1927, the Big Bang theory of the origin of country music is Jimmy Rogers, the Carter family, and others recorded in Bristol all at the same time. And so the Carter family, for instance, had growing up in is it Clinch Mountain? Is it? But in the most isolated rural community, and yet very much influenced by the blues. Or you had somebody like Howlin' Wolf, who you couldn't have a more, a more pure. You couldn't have more pure expression of the African American musical sensibility than Howlin' Wolf. There's nobody who ever been more ferocious or communicated it more directly. And yet when you ask him who his influences were, one of his principal influences, and he always insisted on this, was Jimmy Rogers, the father of country music. And he would describe, and you'd think, when he said that to me, I thought, oh, he's just kidding, kind of, or I don't know what I thought. But then he went on to explain how the plantation he was working on, Jimmy Rogers was singing for the owner of the plantation, sitting up on the veranda or the porch, and Wolf was 15 or 16 years old. Wolf did not tell tales. Everything he said was true. I mean, as far as his own experience went. And so he said, he was just spellbound listening to Jimmy Rogers sing in this on this plantation in the hill country in, I think, West Point, Mississippi. And Jimmy Rogers said, well, I see you've been studying me. I think you're interested in, in what I'm doing. And Wolf real name was Chester Arthur Burnett, so Wolf was Chester then. And he said, oh, yes, sir, I'm very interested. He said, would you like me to show you? And Wolf described how they walked off into the field, and Jimmy Rogers showed him each of his yodels. He had many different yodels, which was the foundation of his style. And Wolf said, and that's what I got my howl from. And I adapted it, and throughout the whole, I don't think there's a single person I've interviewed who did not have a democratic view of music. Now, I'm not talking about their political views. I would hesitate to suggest what this person or that person might believe in terms of conspiracy theories or anything else. But in terms of music, they were wide open, both black and white, to what, it just didn't make any difference. Howlin' Wolf, the first time that I interviewed him, was talking about Elvis Presley as a blues singer. He brought him up. You think I would ever have brought up Elvis Presley to Howlin' Wolf? I mean, and he said, and he's talking about this, you know who I'm talking about, that blues singer from Memphis. And I'm thinking, he couldn't be talking about who I think. And then he said, yeah, the boy went to Hollywood and made the movies. And then he described him, he says, he's singing what's in his soul. He's singing what's in his heart. They're wrong to criticize him. He's in essence, a great blues singer. And that was true from, start to finish with everybody that I've ever interviewed. There just was never a color line. And I think about people like Sam Phillips listening to the radio, the news that came in from, I'm trying to think where it was, but it could be Gabriel, it wasn't Gabriel Heater, but it was somebody like that. And listening to the news, and the news is coming in from outside, from all over the world. This is pre-World War II. And it's just the world is coming together, and it's being brought together by voices and by music and it was a world in which the rules hadn't yet been written. All of the people I wrote about, I've written about, most of them, particularly at the beginning, were ill-educated by conventional standards. Many of them, particularly at the beginning that I wrote about, couldn't read or write. And yet all of them were brilliant in their own ways. And they were not just intuitive, they were brilliant observers, and they picked up on what was going on. And I met all these people, let's say promoters out in East Texas or West Texas, people who had little radio stations. There were no rules for what they had to do. And if they put on somebody like Elvis Presley or Bill Monroe or whatever, they were looking to create an audience, but they also were doing something that nobody else had ever done. And so as far as the difference between now and then, now everything's available. The question is whether the value has been lost to some extent. Mm-hmm. But everything's available, and that's great. The unfortunate thing, and you can just think of it in terms of watching the news, is it's great. Everybody has their own boutique tastes, and everybody gravitates towards it. And they do this with the news. You watch the news that reports the news that you want to hear, but there are no, there will never be another, I'm not talking in terms of talent, there will never be another Elvis Presley, there will never be another Beatles, there will never be another, I'm trying to think of somebody with that kind of centrality. There will never be, because there isn't that degree of magnetism or something. It's just, people will go off. Somebody like Bruce Springsteen develops an enormous and a passionate audience, but it's a very different thing than developing the entire audience. So, and there are good things and bad things. I think overall, it's mostly bad things about the internet. On the other hand, I'm really grateful for it because it's been a great help to me, and I'll take advantage of it to whatever extent. But if I could if I had one wish, if I could do away with it, if I could, do away with one thing, it would be the internet, because I think it's just become the focus for all the hate groups, and it enables and fortifies all of people's worst tendencies.
Connecting up. We're about to go to Q&A, but since you mentioned Howlin' Wolf towards the end, and it sort of underscores your point, you were asked what was one of the most important cultural moments of the 20th century.
Yeah.
You want to share that with the group?
Well, this was this thing where the New York Times actually wanted me, so that was nice. But no, they had some special thing about the most significant cultural, maybe moments of the 20th century. And I said, well, there's no question about it. Number one was Howlin' Wolf on Shindig with the Rolling Stones sitting at his feet, and it was watch it online. It's just a cataclysmic event. And, I would say The Wire might occupy places 4, 5, and 6, but Wolf has 1, 2, and 3 down to himself.
And, when you write about that, you say that you and Alexandra, you didn't watch much TV, but you noticed in the paper that it was going to be on. And if you didn't get it then, you didn't see it. Right?
Yeah, no. And the incredible thing is Alexandra and I see in the, because there wasn't much on TV, and we'd look in the paper and you'd see, and Shindig always had quite a bit of good music. They'd have Jackie Wilson on, they'd have Jerry Lee Lewis. But this particular night, they had the Rolling Stones, and they had somebody named Chester Burnett. And, we're saying to each other, Alexander and I, it couldn't be. No, it couldn't be. No, maybe it's a joke. It couldn't. And we didn't know until Howlin' Wolf came strolling out on stage with his harmonica, which he had upside down. But, oh my God, it is Chester Burnett. It's Howlin' Wolf. And it was, so that would be, I would say, whatever else you do, don't watch the news. I mean, right away, just go back and watch Howlin' Wolf on, then you can go back to the news.
YouTube, great. Well, I think we should open it for questions now, since we've sort of, yeah, back there. Oh, is there a microphone that's going around? Oh, can you wait a second for the mic?
I think I can speak loud. Peter, this is wonderful. I would like to know if you have seen the new Elvis movie and what you think of how accurate.
I haven't. I haven't, no.
Oh, I'd love to hear what you think about it when you do.
Well, I wanted to avoid that question, so I haven't seen it. But, I will say that, we watched recently Mr. Turner, the movie by, what's his name, the English director. There's a movie that is genuinely about creativity, and in the moment, and what's the director's name? Well, anyway, but check out Mr. Turner. No, I just believe, I guess, in difference, in dignity, and never making a fall guy out of a character. It's the easiest thing in the world to take off on somebody you're writing about. If you interviewed me, you could write the worst thing in the world. I mean, it isn't hard to do, and maybe I deserve it. But the point is, it's, and so I feel like that from watching his other movies, that's not what Baz Luhrmann's interested in. So I'm not much interested in.
Also, a question about Elvis. A couple weeks ago, my wife and I were trying to decide what to do, and we said to our family, hey, why don't we go see the new Elvis movie? And our 23-year-old daughter said, are you kidding? All he did is rip off black artists. And I wonder what you would say to her.
Well, she should listen to his music, because basically he was influenced by everybody. And one of his primary influences were the white gospel quartets, the Statesmen in particular, and the singing of Jake Hess. And the white gospel quartets, James Blackwood was a tremendous source, a big help to me when I talked to him. The Blackwood brothers and the Statesmen were the dominant gospel quartets. And he talked at great length about going out on tour with Sister Rosetta, with Dorothy Love Coates and the Gospel Harmonettes, playing Robinson Auditorium in Little Rock, and compared, played Soul Stirrers recordings for me against their recordings. They're quite different. But Elvis was enormously influenced by Bing Crosby, by the Statesmen, by Jake Hess, and by the bass singer Jim Wetherington. By Bill Monroe. He had no more connection with Appalachian culture than he did. He grew up essentially in the midst of, African American culture, but also poor white culture with everything. And, really, all that anybody has to do, they don't have to like Elvis, but all that anybody has to do is to listen to him, to see the diversity of his influences, and also to recognize. The first thing that you have to recognize is, and this is if you're thinking about going into the music business, or if you know the music business, or if you know capitalism at all, the entire basis for the music business is publishing. That's where all the money is. If you're going into it, save your own publishing. It's the only place that the money is made. And basically, the rules for publishing were set up in the 1870s in Europe when it was all sheet music, and they haven't changed since then. And the publisher, the song publisher, could care less who records the music. They make the money. It could be Lithuanian, it could be polka, it could be gypsy, it could be Russian, it could be black, it could be white. It makes absolutely no difference. And that's the entire basis for the music industry. And so when somebody like a 19-year-old kid, like, or 19-year-old kid, like Elvis Presley, who is omnivorous in his love for and knowledge of music, comes up with a song that has been recorded in 1946 and was, might have sold at most 10, 20,000 copies. And this is a song that he loves, and without any attempt whatsoever, there's no musical comparison between his version of Arthur Crudup's That's All Right and Crudup's original. And I'm not going to choose between. They're both great. But he creates something of his own. You could take it as an homage. But when he does that, it just, the thought of either cultural, appropriation or theft, it doesn't exist. What you should be against, if you're against this kind of thing, is capitalism, because that's what it has to do with. But as far as the music goes, there's not a single pure note of music that exists. Now, as far as racism goes, if you want to say that the way in which the person of color was treated, not just in the music business, in every aspect of American life, is disgraceful. Sure, that's absolutely true, but it has nothing to do with the music, which is created by people all over the place, who are influenced equally by the breadth of influences and sources.
We have a house cat.
Yes.
Yeah, it's over there.
You've talked predominantly tonight about male artists. Could you say a few words about some of the women artists that you've interviewed who have made significant contributions in terms of creativity?
This is something which I missed out on. The areas of music that I was writing about at the beginning, in blues, had I been writing about 1920s blues, they were dominated by women. But the solo, down-home blues was dominated almost 95% by men. I mean, with the soul music, I talked at length with people like Carla Thomas, with Mabel John, Little Willie John's sister Mabel John, with Dionne Warwick, about going out on tour. And what they described was a system that was so inimical. It was so inimical to the presence of women. They all went out with chaperones. In some cases, their mother. In Mabel John's case, her brother, who was the worst chaperone in the world. So now, in gospel music, was dominated by women. I mean, whether you're talking about Mahalia Jackson or Sister Rosetta Tharpe, I mean, it was just so many of the stars, not the quartets so much, but the individual voices. And I wish I had written about that, but I didn't.
Anything about Aretha Franklin?
She's the person. I mean, she's the heroine of sweet soul music, and she's somebody who, I did everything I could to describe the breadth and the dimensions of her genius and of her heartache too. So I mean, she just turned the whole music climate around. I don't think anybody came close to her. What she opened up in '67 with "I Never Loved a Man" and continued from that point on. Now, I kept trying to interview her for almost 40 years, 35 years anyway. And I finally got to interview her for the Sam Cooke documentary we did. And the only reason I got to interview her, and I think if she were here she would say it, was because L.C. Cooke, Sam's brother, who was a wonderful guy and a wonderful friend, came along with me. And Aretha was totally taken with Sam most of all, but basically with any of the Cooke brothers. I mean, she was very, very fond of L.C. So that was how I got the interview. And it was, in a certain sense, it was a brilliant interview in that she was very well spoken. She had she spoke with, you know, incisiveness, but it was something, and it was a great television. It was for this documentary. It was great for sound bites, but I could not get her to budge off of, you know, a script which she had devised many years ago. I'm not blaming her for it, but I mean, if I asked her about a bishop in New Orleans who had promoted gospel music when she first went out with her father, the Reverend C.L., who was also a big, big influence on the music, she would say, yes, Pastor so-and-so. And then she would just immediately pass on to the... But she was a woman of such complexity and I think such heartbreak, too. And I wish I could have... at one point, Atlantic Records asked me to annotate a box set that they were putting out, I think in the 90s. And I said yes, and I would have done it for nothing. I didn't care about the money. I said, but I'll only do it if you can get me an interview with Aretha. And that went back and forth. But she just didn't do interviews. And in her own autobiography, it ended up being almost a cookbook because she just took everything out of it that provided any revelation. So this is not a complaint or anything. I mean, but man, if you watch, for instance, when she was it Carole King who got the the Medal of Freedom, and Aretha sang "Natural Woman" at that, and that was quite late. And you watch that; it's unbelievable. And you watch her, the music that she sang long after she had gotten sick at the funerals. This is on YouTube of some of her friends in gospel. It's just stupendous. It's magnificent. It's transcendent. And she doesn't have the voice that she had, but she has. So yeah, I would have given anything to write a book on her, or on Mavis Staples for that matter.
Yeah.
But I didn't.
And sweet soul music. I mean, that's magnificent on Aretha. One more question? Okay, yeah.
How do you feel the artists you wrote about in this book compare to the artists of the modern day in terms of how much more deep their lyrics are and music and or backgrounds?
I don't think, I think there's always going to be the same amount of creativity. I think the world, I forget what the word is. It's not entropy, but it's, I think there's always going to be the same amount of creativity. I don't think, I don't think there's any less or, where I think creativity doesn't enter into it is when you have people who are trying to recreate something that's gone, or to imitate, let's say. I don't think that does much, but no, I think there's no question. I mean, I get playlists for my granddaughters, and I listen to stuff, and I just wouldn't pretend to be an expert on anything that I don't know that well. But there's no difference. People are aspiring to the same thing. The only thing is, it's like I've got a nephew who's fairly prominent in quite a number of musical fields, but and he's done a couple of albums where he's sung his own songs and played the trumpet on them as opposed to what he does on stage. But I said to him one time, he doesn't have the greatest voice in the world, but I said, man, you should just stop treating your voice. You should stop, obscuring it. Just sing in the voice that you have, like Howlin' Wolf, like Billy Joe Shaver, you don't have to have a great voice. It's just what you communicate. That's the only thing that, he's got the same degree of creativity, but I think it's the extent to which, people are afraid of, and this doesn't cut across the board at all, but they're afraid of mistakes or the sounds. I mean, to me, I'm interested in human sounds. That's really, and so that sort of sets me apart from a lot of stuff. But I mean, it means a lot of stuff. Just doesn't mean that much to me. But to have this sort of all this treatment of it. I mean, I think of this with my nephew. The songs he writes, what he has to communicate, the way in which he communicates it, is really deeply felt. It's emotional. It's eloquent. But I'm thinking geez, forget about trying to make your voice into something mechanical. Just let your voice be your voice. So, but I don't mean that that's an across-the-board concern, and I I don't think there's anything to fault about. It's not like yesterday was better than today. It's an impossibility. I mean, there's no, no generation is, every generation comes along and thinks it's invented everything, but it's not true for, of any generation, and each generation has its own, avatars, but also each individual has his or her own, form of original expression that is no different and no less compelling than those who've gone before.
Well put. Well put. This is great.